January 6, 1952. This police action, for that's what the UN officially calls it, began in June 1950. No one then imagined it would go on into 1951, let alone still be going as 1951 came to its end. But that is what happened, for it is now 1952. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week it was Christmas, but peace had not taken over in Korea. Any new large-scale UN offensives were off the table for the time being, sure, but there was an ongoing campaign against guerrilla fighters that claimed lives in the thousands, as well as platoon-sized attacks and skirmishes along the lines. At the negotiating table, the POW lists and POW numbers caused suspicion and mistrust on both sides. I've mentioned a couple of times over the months that much official opinion on the UN side holds that should there be an armistice, a political conference to follow it to nail down a permanent peace settlement would probably be unsuccessful. So an armistice might be all they could get for quite some time. And based on that supposed likelihood, the character of an armistice should provide for at least some degree of permanency, and the conditions should at least be somewhat enforceable. Also, Washington thinks that any enemy violations of an armistice would maybe not be large-scale renewed aggression, but more along the lines of threats and demonstrations. They think this because what they see as the major deterrent to renewed hostilities would be the other side realizing that doing so would be treated with full retribution, not just against North Korea, but against Communist China. I mentioned last time that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American Secretary of State Dean Acheson made such a declaration in late November. They've been working on an expanded declaration with as many UN signatories as possible to be issued after an armistice is concluded. British and American leaders, both military and political, have been meeting in December and now in January as well. Thing is, there are fundamental differences in their policies because of their differing attitudes towards Mao Zedong's communist mainland China and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China on Taiwan. The British recognize Mao's government, the US doesn't, and the British established trade relations with it, regarding it as a permanent entity. The United States, on the other hand, knew that as long as Communist China remained aggressive and showed no signs of changing its attitude towards the West, there was no point in according the Communists the advantages that recognition would entail, such as a seat in the United Nations or formal trade relations. Besides, the United States had certain obligations towards Chiang Kai-shek and the Taiwan government which it could not easily avoid. Since the United States acknowledged the ecumenic interests of the British in the Far East, the US policy planners felt the British must, in turn, realize the United States must bear the major responsibility for the area and supply the power to meet this responsibility. The U.S. National Security Council, the NSC, recommended last month that the U.S. continue the policy of avoiding general war with China or the USSR while seeking a settlement in Korea that would not hurt U.S. positions on Taiwan or Communist China not getting a seat at the UN, and that limited war as it is now and economic pressure on Red China, backed by most of the UN, should continue until an armistice. Then, of course, they try to find a permanent political settlement to the Korea issue. But in the meantime, the ROK army would be strengthened and prepared to deter or repel a further attempt by the communists to take over South Korea. The council was now convinced that with proper training and equipment, the ROK army could eventually bear the brunt of the defense of South Korea. Only if the armistice negotiations failed would the Council consider the additional measures of mobilization and forms of military pressure to solve the situation. The ROK is the South Koreans. This decision defers a full blockade of mainland China or extending the air war into Manchuria. But the US feels that the UN wouldn't support a stricter economic embargo on China now anyhow. And as I said, America's best pals, the British, have trade relations with China. They've also been in economic crisis since World War II. And that trade helps out. And of course, they are very worried what might happen with Hong Kong, which is pretty exposed, should there be more pressure on the Chinese communists. Well, these conferences between the two powers lately don't change anyone's policy, but they do reassure each other. Neither wants an extension of the war, and as long as the truce talks continue, they can adjust their attitudes toward China as needed. Are there war hawks? Sure there are. But for all those who think a military solution in Korea necessary or desirable, even if it means fighting China full scale, American General Charles Bolte, Deputy Chief of Staff of Planning, has words for you as 1951 becomes 1952. He says that the United States had no certain current military capability for reaching a favorable decision in the Far East and no knowledge of how long it would take to acquire such a capability. Only by a drastic change in the global strategy of the United States, or through an all-out mobilization of national resources, could the military capability be immediately increased. The first might cause great danger to the national security, and the second would create grave economic problems, which might play directly into the hands of the Soviet Union. UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway pretty much confirms this position. He too says, with regard to UN planners threatening a spread of the war should the communists break an armistice, that with presently available military forces, his command would be incapable of imposing a threat to communist China sufficient in itself to deter it from renewed aggression. But in the US and the UN, pressure is mounting for an early ceasefire and armistice. The mounting casualty lists are not popular with the general public, and a lot of people around the world want US troops freed up so they can be redeployed elsewhere. As long as the US is pouring resources into a hot war, that by necessity restricts the amount of stuff they can send to the parts of the world engaged in the Cold War. Well, the truce talks continue as 1952 begins. The first few days of January 1952, the UNC offered several minor concessions, including surrender of its demand for aerial observation, but enemy negotiators rejected each probe, and attempts to find a common ground on the staff level were to no avail. On January 1st, Admiral Joy summed up the situation. The communists, he said, would grow old sitting at the table if they expected the UNC to yield any further. UN Delegate Ruthven Libby brings up the question of civilian internees. He's part of the sub-delegation to deal with the POW issue. This might seem more of a political than a military thing, but his opposite number, General Lee, has shown in the past that he's not actually opposed to it being included in an armistice settlement. They have some discussions, and they managed to agree that displaced civilians being allowed to choose where they were to be repatriated might be a good thing. Libby then argues that since it would be military commanders who would supervise the movement of such civilians, an agreement about this should be written into the armistice stipulations. So with that pretty much settled, Libby is ready with a UN proposal. There were three major areas of disagreement to be resolved, he began. Both parties want all of the prisoners released, but the UN command wished to do this under an equitable formula. Secondly, there was the disposition of the ex-ROK soldiers who had been impressed into the North Korean army. The United Nations command desired all in this category return to POW status. And lastly, there was the question of what standards to use in determining to which side a prisoner belonged. The UNC claimed the place of residence should be the deciding factor. The communists maintained that the army in which a man served when captured should establish his nationality. Libby says the UN is prepared to make a fair compromise to solve all of this. They will accept the idea that a soldier who becomes a prisoner can, when released, choose to return to his army or join his captors. This is something the communist side has advocated in the past, but they wish to extend this to all prisoners, whether they be military or civilian. He also suggests the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, be the supervisor for the interviews with the prisoners. The UN holds way more prisoners than the communists do, though. So prisoners in excess of a one-for-one exchange would be let go, but they would not be allowed to fight against their captor again. Well, that's those that went home. Those that choose to stay would be prohibited from taking up arms against the other side too. They couldn't fight the war anymore either way. It was neatly done. Since the communists had permitted the ROK troops captured in the early stages of the war to join the North Korean forces or to choose release at the front, they had practiced voluntary repatriation. At the time, it had been to their advantage to swell their ranks and to lighten the burden of guarding large numbers of prisoners. Now this policy was being turned against them. They had provided United Nations Command with a propaganda lever, and with only a comparatively small bag of prisoners to bargain with, the communists were placed at a distinct disadvantage. And, should a large proportion of prisoners held by the UN refuse to return to communist life, there's no real way to fight that negative publicity. Voluntary repatriation may be unusual, but it sure has global humanitarian appeal. It can be attacked on legal grounds, I guess, but I have no idea how that would go. However, the US and its UN allies are now officially linked with the concept. And once public support is strongly in favor, one day, somewhere, it might be really hard, if not impossible, for them to try to make any other kind of release. Well, on January 2nd comes the first reaction from the communist side, and it's pretty much what you may expect. Lee Sang-cho leads the attack. He calls the whole thing absurd, saying the release and repatriation of prisoners of war is not a trade of slaves, nor is the 20th century the barbarous age of slavery. He pays no attention at all to the inconsistency he's showing by attacking a policy which his side actually introduced into practice in this conflict. Libby hits Lee over his concern for the possible defection of Chinese troops. After all, the communist side has repeated time and time again that they are volunteers, part of an army made up solely of such volunteers who wish to fight for the KPA, the North Korean army. Surely, all of these volunteers, who are now POWs, would want to go back to communist China, so what's the worry? Lee does not rise to this, but keeps repeating his slave trade allegations. Libby says, "Your analysis is faulty, your arguments are specious, and your conclusions are wrong." Outside of that, it was a nice piece of work. But hey, despite this, UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy sees reason for optimism. They are at least discussing the merits of a proposal that they initially said was too unreasonable to discuss. That is something, I guess. What happens this week really is of major import only at the conference table, where the POW issue is center stage, or at the political table, where the British and Americans try to figure out how to enforce an armistice and what might be a good deterrent against further hostilities. The field is quiet except for the patrols that go out nightly, or the small skirmishes that break out here or there. The past few weeks, phases 1 and 2 of Operation Rat Killer have been in action. This is an operation to capture or kill guerrilla fighters in the mountainous parts of the south who have been harassing UN forces. Phase 3 begins today, January 6th, and is a return to the Kyrgyzstan area that was the focus of Phase 1, and they're now trying to catch those guerrillas that managed to slip past them before. Also, during December, Marine troops have requested air support 22 times, but Marine pilots are under 5th Air Force Command, which restricts close air support, so they've only gotten such air support 5 times. Actually, here's another note relating to the Marines and air power. Earlier this year, the Marines introduced the helicopter to the battlefield, and a lot of people were skeptical because helicopters seemed really vulnerable. However, as 1951 comes to its end, this new frontline weapon has not only proven its value, but not a single helicopter pilot has been lost to enemy fire. Here is a quote to end this year from Volume 3 of Bud Hanning's Korean War Chronology. "The year comes to an end with an armistice that is not actually an armistice, but it is in conjunction with a war that is not officially a war, at least if it is referred to by people not on the battlefield. In Korea, to the troops, it has been and continues to be a war. Later, it is often referred to as the Forgotten War. However, no serviceman who spends even one day in the Korean conflict, particularly during winter, will ever forget it." Hannings also writes that at the stroke of midnight, December 31st, 1951, the 11th Marines, far from Times Square, ring in the new year with a massive artillery bombardment of enemy positions. And now it's 1952. It is well over a decade now that I have been covering 20th century conflicts, week by week by week. And I shall be here throughout 2026 covering the events in Korea in 1952. I can do this thanks to the sterling efforts of the Time Ghost Army. That is what allows us to do this and to do it independently of outside influences. Eric Ferguson is the Army Member of the Week here. I have a vague feeling that I may have already used that name, so if I have, then you are the Army Member of the Week for a second time, you lucky guy, and if I have not, then just enjoy your week like everyone else does. These are the newest commissioned officers. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.